Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and today I'm joined by the mighty Laura Dodd, Forbidden Planet's head book buyer, and we are both privileged to be here chatting with Alex Aniel, the author of Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of Resident Evil. Thanks so much for joining us today, Alex. How are you, mate?
I'm great. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, mate, the pleasure's all ours. Laura, who is dressed for the occasion, of course. Over to you, mate.
So what can you tell us about your latest project, Itchy Tasty, the unauthorized history of Resident Evil?
Yeah, so I spent about 3.5 years putting the book together. I decided to write it back in 2017 after I attended a video game event called the Game Developers Conference, GDC. And what sprung me into wanting to write this book was a talk that I attended at the show in San Francisco that time. And it was from the director of Resident Evil 7, who gave an explanation of why he created the game in the way that he did. For a little context, Resident Evil 7 was a very big change compared to previous Resident Evil games, and it was a bit of a risk for Capcom, but from a quality and a commercial perspective, it was one that paid off. And I thought the talk that I heard was extremely interesting, and I had realized the entire Resident Evil series had had a very interesting and colorful development history up until that point. By 2017, the series had just turned 20 or 21 years old. So I thought there was a lot to talk about. And with me personally, I live in Tokyo, Japan, even though I'm originally from San Francisco in the US. And I do speak Japanese and English. And I feel like that gives me a more direct pathway to speaking with a lot of the Japanese creators of the Resident Evil series, both past and present. So I thought I should take that skill, put it to good use, and find out the more interesting and intricate parts of the development of all the different Resident Evil games. And like you, Andrew, I'm mostly a writing person. I'm not a writer per se anymore. I used to do it, but I'm more in tune to writing than I am making documentaries or podcasts or things like that. So I thought writing a book was the most logical way to approach a project like this.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, makes sense.
And this was it was a crowd-funded project. So were you kind of expecting the amount of people that got on board, or was it like a surprise?
I was actually very surprised. Yes. I had no idea I would end up crowdfunding the book, but in retrospect, it did make the most sense. The people at Unbound have been absolutely gracious in working with me, giving me a lot of decision-making ability, but also offering a lot of helpful advice. I did shop around for publishers, but it's not my forte. Like, I'm not familiar with working with publishers. So I feel like Unbound in that regard was the most approachable because as a crowdfunding publisher, they want to minimize their risk as well, right? Because they probably know how a project can succeed. They know how to make books and make them to publication or get them published. But the usual onerous requirements of getting something published, right? Settling for something, less ideal in terms of payout or whatever. That wasn't something that I had to deal with at Unbound, which helped me out a lot because I have other commitments with work and such. And overall, it's a very easy process. The crowdfunding campaign itself began in October 2019. It got off to a good start, but it didn't hit the funding goal as quickly as some might have imagined, but it only took maybe 2 months. I think actually
that's pretty good.
Like, it was like a day before Christmas that year when it did hit the funding goal. And I remember being at a company. Exactly, yeah. I remember being at a company Christmas party when it did hit the 100% mark, and we were able to celebrate right on the spot. So it was very, very fortuitous timing.
That is amazing. Now, Alex, there's a very rich history connected to Resident Evil. So when was your first personal exposure to the series?
Yeah, so as a lot of people familiar with my work might know, the first Resident Evil game that I ever played was indeed Resident Evil Code Veronica. And the reason why I started with that game was because I actually got into a different survival horror game, Silent Hill, before I actually started Resident Evil. And I loved the first Silent Hill. I felt like that was a very strong way to get into the genre of horror games. And at the time, Silent Hill was still a new franchise. The second game hadn't come out. So I wanted to try other franchises that were in the same genre. And of course, everybody recommended Resident Evil. At the same time, the Dreamcast had already come out. So I wanted to play something on my new Dreamcast. And Resident Evil Code Veronica was the horror game of that platform. Very visually groundbreaking for the time. And it was quite a long game as well. And I liked Code Veronica just as much as I did Silent Hill, and that's what set me on the path to becoming extremely obsessed with the series.
I think it was a similar. I'd played the early games, but Code Veronica's always had like a special place in my heart because obviously it's the first one that kind of brings Claire and Chris together.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I'm happy to hear that. It's a great game.
It's
Absolutely.
a fantastic game, and a remake would be amazing, I think, if they do maybe remake.
I agree. Yeah, I think if they remade it the way they did with Resident Evil 2, it would be a fantastic and engaging experience. So one can hope in the next few years they get around to it.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure it will have that difficulty spike as well. Like I was talking about it earlier, how the original Resident Evils, you kind of get used to running and there's only so much that can surprise you. But with RE2, I think when everyone booted it up and it was just like, oh my God, they're chasing me and they can actually get me and like floor me and stuff. So yeah, it's a lot more difficult than it used to be, but also scarier.
I mean, I was 13 when I first played Code Veronica in 2000. So I guess as a 13-year-old, I was able to figure out how to beat the game eventually. And I even wrote guides for it around that age. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people do complain about the difficulty of Code Veronica, but I've never specifically been able to empathize with that viewpoint because 20 years ago when I was 13, I was able to get through the game with relative ease. I don't know, maybe it just makes me biased, but yeah.
Fair enough.
Something that Laura and I were talking about before you came on camera was outside of Code Veronica, what your top 3 games in the series are.
Oh yeah, that's actually an easy one. Resident Evil 4 is by far the top Resident Evil for me, just holistically in terms of quality and innovation, the more endearing elements of the game as a whole. Resident Evil 4 is definitely at the top. I would say the Resident Evil 2 remake is probably behind it, just behind it. That came out pretty recently, but that was also another game where when it came out and I played it for the first time, it just fit like a glove. It was perfect. The graphics were amazing, even though they hadn't followed that particular gameplay loop in such a long time. They proved that it could still work in a modern game. So yeah, Resident Evil 2 remake was fantastic, and probably rounding out the top 3 for me is Resident Evil 7, and it's also a very different game from the others. I wasn't so sure about the first person viewpoint at first because they were Resident Evil games in first person prior to that varied in quality. But Resident Evil 7, I feel like the direction was fantastic. It was a very frightening game at times, very disturbing. And especially in the context of it having been made in response to Resident Evil 6's mixed commercial and mixed critical performance. You know, it's remarkable that they were able to turn that ship around. So it really blew my socks off for sure. So those are probably my 3 favorite Resident Evil games.
Yes, yeah. I think people were kind of finally fell back in love with the series from RE7 because RE5 was it was okay as a multiplayer, but as a single player game, yeah. And then RE6 was, oof.
Everything after Resident Evil 4 never really, I guess, unified the fan base.
Yes.
If that makes sense. I mean, even Resident Evil 4 has its detractors because some people thought it wasn't horror enough, or it wasn't enough like the games that came before it, which is, it's a fair criticism. But as a game and the product in and of itself, it was by far like the best made game of the series. But 5, 6, they all had things about them that didn't really quite grab certain groups of people. And I would say 6 probably has more detractors than it does supporters in general. So Resident Evil 7 was definitely a return to form overall.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's a scary ass game. So I have to kind of like ask, so we can obviously do like favorite heroes, villains, etc. But let's start with, what do you think is the most OP weapon in the series?
The most OP weapon, I mean, the rocket launcher and those variants, especially if you unlock the infinite rocket launchers, or you buy them as DLC, that does make the game pretty easy. So I would probably go with that, but that's probably the obvious answer. I mean, if you want the weapon that does way more damage than you think it would, I would say the knife in Code Veronica is definitely a very potent weapon when used properly. You can take down hordes of zombies just with the knife in that game, and it's a really interesting design approach that they used in that game.
That's definitely ticking the Dodd box, isn't it, mate?
Well, if you think that, say, if the apocalypse happens tomorrow, what are you going to have in your kitchen? You're probably going to
have a knife,
cutlery.
Yeah.
So most of us don't have like a gun cupboard. So
for my my Dyson vacuums suction tube.
Yeah, right.
Put a little distance between me and the monster.
Now, guys, we're racing towards the end of our time together. And one of the things Laura and I were talking about was just, I know you've got some questions about 2021 and beyond, Laura.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. So obviously this is a very exciting year for Resident Evil, both obviously with your fantastic book coming out, as well as RE Village. We've got the reboots of the films. We've got a TV series. What are you most excited about from all the new stuff that's coming?
Yeah, it's an unexpectedly very, very busy year. I thought COVID would have made it very difficult for so many things in the same franchise to come out in one calendar year. So I'm very happy about all that I have to look forward to. I would say, yes, Resident Evil Village is probably the most exciting thing to look forward to this year, but that's because I've always been into the games above all, and Resident Evil Village looks to continue a lot of what made Resident Evil 7 such a great experience. So I'm hoping they're able to improve on it.
Yes, yeah. Have you played the Maiden demo yet?
I have, yes.
Yes.
It was very, very brief but interesting look into how the game is going to turn out. So quite excited.
Yes, yeah. At first I was like, oh, you can't actually, you can't, there's no combat in this. This is weird. And then you're just like, no, it's very atmospheric, very beautiful, and like, yeah, very terrifying. So perfect.
Yeah.
And guys, before we wrap up, I know that Dodd has a Silent Hill question. I
do, yes. So obviously I'm a Silent Hill fan as well, but it's been a long time since there's been a good Silent Hills game. So with all the kind of the PT stuff that didn't happen, and there's talk of maybe a new Silent Hill game coming along at some point. Do you think that's more likely to happen now with the success of the kind of new Resi stuff?
It's really hard to say. I would personally love to have a new Silent Hill game released with nice fancy HD graphics and kind of a return to form. I would love for Silent Hill to go back to what it was doing with Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3 especially. It's really hard to say. Yeah, I mean, Resident Evil is at the top of the horror scene in terms of popularity, probably rivaled only by The Last of Us if you look at that as a horror game. But it, that's not really something, that's not a universal belief as far as I can tell. And so, the way those rumors have been presented, so I guess it's like what, Sony developing a Silent Hill game? I mean,
Yeah.
I guess, but I mean, eh, I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. But I would absolutely love to see a new Silent Hill game, though. I do think it's overdue. I do think PT was definitely a very nice prototype to how a compellingly developed Silent Hill game could be. And I really hope somebody finds a way to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, now's the time. The appetite is there for scary games.
1000%. I couldn't agree more. And Alex, on a closing note, to flip back to Itchy Tasty itself, which everybody watching this can order from the links attached to the interview right here. What are you proudest of about Itchy Tasty and Unofficial History of Resident Evil?
I mean, I have to tell myself, hey, I wrote a book. It's getting published. People are spending their money on it because, even though they haven't read the book yet, they have some level of belief that I'm presenting them with something that they feel like is worth spending money on, especially in this day and age when COVID's uprooted our, various economies, and, people have to be more careful with their money. So that's been the most, I guess, humbling part of the experience. People, I mean, I know the funding goal wasn't made public by Unbound, but it is not a trivial amount of money to have made this book happen. And so, I'm really grateful to the 1,000 plus people, all of them who put their faith in me and said, okay, I want to buy this book, even though I don't know what's going to be in it, because I trust this person. And I think he has something that I think is worth reading. So that's been probably the thing I'm most proud of.
Here, mate. I completely get that. And on that note, you've been watching myself, Andrew Sumner, and the mighty Laura Dodd chat to Alex about his all-new book, Itchy Tasty, and an official history of Resident Evil, which is amazing and you will be blown away by, and you can order from the links attached to this video. Thanks so much for joining us today, mate. It's lovely to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
Take care and all the best. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.